At some point, it starts to feel like your brain is working against you. The same thoughts repeat, the same patterns return, the same loops form again and again. And even after you've seen it, even after you understand that it's happening, it still continues. But your brain is not doing this randomly. It is not repeating thoughts without a reason. It is following a process, one that is built into how it functions, because your brain is designed to detect patterns, hold onto them, and return to them when they seem relevant. That process is what allows you to learn, to remember, to recognize what matters. But the same system that helps you learn can also keep you stuck. Because once a pattern is marked as important, your brain doesn't easily let it go. And that is where these loops begin. Not as a mistake, but as a function that is working exactly as it was designed to. The question is not why your brain creates loops. It's why it keeps choosing the same ones. Your brain is constantly trying to predict what might happen next. It uses past experience, stored patterns, and repeated thoughts to build expectations about the future. And when something feels uncertain, that predictive system becomes more active. It starts generating possibilities, running through scenarios, trying to find an outcome that feels clear. But if the situation doesn't have a clear answer, the process doesn't stop. It continues, and that continuation creates repetition. The same possibilities are revisited, the same outcomes are imagined, the same questions are asked again and again. This is not your brain failing. It is your brain trying to resolve uncertainty. It keeps returning to the same thought because it hasn't found something that feels complete. And because it hasn't found that completion, it continues the process. This is how a loop forms at the deepest level. Not from randomness, but from a system that is trying to predict and resolve at the same time. There is also a strong connection between loops and memory. When a thought is repeated, it becomes easier to access. The pathway that leads to it becomes more defined, more efficient, more available. This is how your brain optimizes itself. It strengthens what is used frequently and reduces what is not. So the more a thought is revisited, the more likely it is to appear again. Over time, this creates a bias. Certain thoughts become dominant, not because they are more accurate, but because they have been reinforced. And once that happens, your brain begins to favor those patterns automatically. It returns to them without needing a strong trigger. This is why loops feel familiar, because they are built on pathways that have been used repeatedly, and that familiarity makes them easier to continue, not because they are important, but because they are available. Another key factor is how your brain assigns importance. It does not evaluate thoughts in a neutral way. It uses signals like emotion, repetition, and attention to decide what matters. If a thought creates a strong reaction, your brain marks it as significant. If it repeats often, it becomes familiar. If it holds your attention, it becomes reinforced. And when those signals combine, the thought is treated as something that should be maintained, something that should be revisited. This is why certain thoughts return more often than others, not because they are more relevant, but because they have been marked as important by the system itself. And once that marking happens, your brain continues to prioritize them. This is how loops gain strength, not through logic, but through the signals your brain uses to decide what matters. Another reason your brain creates loops is because it is designed to detect problems and keep them active until they are resolved. This system is useful when there is something that actually needs a solution. It allows you to stay focused, to keep returning to an issue until it is understood or completed. But not all thoughts are problems that can be solved. Many are based on uncertainty, interpretation, or possibilities that don't lead to a clear outcome. And when your brain treats those thoughts as problems, it continues to work on them as if a solution exists. That creates repetition. The thought is revisited, examined, and expanded, but because there is no clear resolution, the process never completes. And because it never completes, your brain keeps it active. This is what turns thinking into a loop. The system is trying to solve something that does not have a final answer, and because it expects one, it continues. So the loop is not created by the thought itself. It is created by how your brain categorizes it as something that needs to be solved, even when it cannot be. There is also a strong link between loops and the brain's need for certainty. When something feels unclear, incomplete, or unpredictable, your brain responds by trying to reduce that uncertainty as quickly as possible. It does this by generating explanations, creating interpretations, and running through different possibilities. Each thought is an attempt to make sense of something that doesn't feel fully defined. But if the uncertainty remains, the process doesn't stop. It continues generating more thoughts, more interpretations, more possibilities, and because none of them feel fully certain, the system keeps going. This creates a cycle where thinking becomes the response to uncertainty, and uncertainty keeps thinking active. The loop forms because the brain is trying to reach a level of clarity that the situation does not provide. And until that expectation changes, the system continues trying to resolve what cannot be fully resolved. Another layer comes from how your brain connects thoughts together. It does not process ideas in isolation. Each thought is linked to others through association, memory, and pattern recognition. So when a thought appears, it doesn't stay alone. It activates related ideas, similar experiences, and connected interpretations, and those connections create a sequence. That sequence feels natural. It feels like a logical progression, something that is unfolding step by step, but those steps are being generated automatically based on existing patterns. And because those patterns are already established, the sequence is easy to follow. Your brain moves through it quickly, without needing to create something new. This is what gives loops their structure. They are not random repetitions, they are sequences built from familiar connections. And because those connections already exist, the loop can continue without effort. It simply follows the path that has been reinforced the most. There is also an efficiency factor in how your brain operates. It prefers to reuse existing patterns rather than create entirely new ones. This reduces effort and allows it to process information more quickly. So when a familiar thought pattern is available, your brain is more likely to use it. It becomes the default path, the easiest route to follow when your mind is active. This is why loops feel automatic, because they are efficient. They do not require new processing. They rely on pathways that are already built. And the more those pathways are used, the stronger they become, which makes them even easier to access in the future. Over time, this creates a system where certain patterns dominate. They appear more often, last longer, and connect more easily to other thoughts. And that dominance is what keeps the loop active, not because it is necessary, but because it is the most efficient path your brain has learned to follow. Another key reason your brain creates loops is because it is constantly trying to maintain coherence. It prefers thoughts that fit together, that form a consistent narrative, that makes sense when viewed as a whole. When something doesn't fit, when there is a gap or contradiction, your brain keeps working on it. It returns to the same ideas, trying to adjust them, trying to make them align with everything else it already knows, and when that alignment doesn't happen, the process repeats. This is what gives loops their persistence. They are not just random repetitions. They are attempts to create consistency between thoughts, memories, and interpretations. And because your brain values that consistency, it keeps revisiting the same material, trying to refine it, trying to make it fit. But when the thought itself is based on something uncertain or incomplete, that consistency can never fully form. So the loop continues, not because it is progressing, but because it is trying to stabilize something that cannot be fully stabilized. There is also a timing element in how loops form and sustain themselves. Thoughts often appear in moments when your attention is not fully occupied. When there is space, your brain fills it with whatever patterns are most available, and those patterns are usually the ones that have been reinforced the most. The thoughts you've returned to, the ideas you've engaged with, the loops that have been repeated. So the moment there is a gap, your brain activates those patterns again. Not because they are needed, but because they are ready. This is why loops often feel like they come back on their own. You're not actively choosing them, but the conditions are there for them to reappear. And once they appear, the same sequence begins again. The same connections, the same expansions, the same repetition. This creates the feeling that the loop is always there, waiting to continue, because in a way, it is. Another important factor is how your brain responds to familiarity. Familiar thoughts feel easier to process. They require less effort, less adjustment, less uncertainty, and because of that, your brain prefers them. This preference creates a bias. When multiple thoughts are possible, your brain is more likely to select the one it already recognizes, the one it has seen before, the one it knows how to follow. And that selection reinforces the loop. It brings the same thoughts back into focus, even when new possibilities exist. Over time, this makes the loop feel like the default. It becomes the pattern your mind returns to without needing a reason. And because it feels familiar, it doesn't stand out as something unusual. It feels like part of how your mind works. But that familiarity is not a sign of accuracy or importance. It is a sign of repetition. And repetition is what keeps the loop active. At this point, the loop begins to feel like something built into your thinking, not a temporary pattern, but a constant feature of how your mind operates. And that perception makes it feel more difficult to change. Because if something feels built in, it feels permanent. It feels like something that cannot be adjusted or altered. But what this actually reflects is how consistently the same patterns have been used. The loop feels permanent because it has been reinforced repeatedly over time, and anything that has been reinforced can also be changed. Not instantly and not by force, but by altering the conditions that allowed it to form in the first place. This is what shifts the perspective. The loop is not a fixed part of your mind. It is a pattern your brain has learned, and anything learned can be unlearned, or at least reshaped, and that is where the possibility of change comes from. As you begin to understand how these loops are created, something important becomes clearer. The loop is not a single event. It is a process made up of multiple steps happening in sequence. A thought appears, it is recognized, it is engaged with, and then it is continued. Each of those steps contributes to the loop, but they do not all have the same weight. The most critical step is not the appearance of the thought, but what happens after it appears. Because that is where the loop either continues or stops, not at the level of the thought itself, but at the level of interaction. This shifts the focus away from trying to control what your brain produces and toward understanding how you respond to it. Because the production of thoughts is automatic, but the continuation is conditional, and when you begin to see the process in this way, the loop no longer feels like something that exists on its own. It becomes something that is built step by step. And anything built step by step can also be interrupted at any point in that sequence. There is also a change in how you interpret the presence of a loop once you understand its structure. Instead of seeing it as something that has taken over, it becomes something that is unfolding. That shift in perspective reduces its intensity, because it is no longer experienced as something fixed or overwhelming. It is experienced as something in motion, something that is happening step by step. And when something is seen as a sequence, it becomes easier to recognize where it can change. You begin to notice the moments where the thought could be followed or not followed, expanded or not expanded. Those moments may be brief, but they exist. And recognizing them changes how the loop develops, because the loop depends on continuity. It depends on each step leading into the next without interruption. And when that continuity is broken, even slightly, the structure begins to weaken. Not because the thought disappears, but because the sequence does not fully form. Useful in many situations. It allows you to understand patterns, anticipate outcomes, and refine your thinking. But when it is applied to thoughts that do not lead to resolution, it continues without reaching an endpoint. This is where the system becomes inefficient. It keeps running. Not because it is helping, but because it has not received a signal to stop. And that signal is not something your brain generates on its own. It comes from a change in how the process is engaged with. When the loop is no longer reinforced in the same way, the system begins to adjust. It reduces activity in that pattern, shifts attention elsewhere, and allows the process to settle. And that adjustment is what gradually changes how often the loop appears. There is also a noticeable shift in how quickly loops form once you understand how they work. Before, the process would begin without being noticed, and by the time you were aware of it, the loop was already established. Now, the beginning becomes more visible. You notice the first thought, the first connection, the first moment where the sequence could develop, and that early awareness changes the trajectory. Because the loop relies on building momentum, it needs time and continuity to form. When that momentum is interrupted early, the loop does not reach the same level of intensity. It starts, but it does not fully develop. This reduces the overall impact of the loop. It becomes shorter, less immersive, less capable of dominating your attention. And over time, this changes how your mind responds to those patterns, because what once formed easily now requires conditions that are no longer consistently present. As this understanding becomes more consistent, the loops begin to lose their authority. They no longer feel like something that must be followed or resolved. They feel like patterns that are being recognized as they occur. This reduces the sense of urgency that once drove them. The thought may still appear, but it does not carry the same pressure to be completed or understood immediately. And without that pressure, the loop loses one of its main sources of energy. It no longer has the same force pushing it forward. This changes how it behaves. It becomes less persistent, less repetitive, less dominant, because the loop is no longer being treated as something that requires attention at all costs. It becomes something that can exist without being expanded. And that is what allows it to begin fading naturally. This doesn't mean the system stops generating thoughts or forming patterns. That part of your brain remains active, but the way those patterns develop changes. They become shorter, less connected, less likely to form extended sequences. Thoughts appear, but they do not automatically lead to more thinking in the same way. This creates a different experience, one where your mind is still active, but not constantly looping. There is movement, but not repetition. And that difference is what makes the change noticeable. The absence of loops is not silence, but variation. Thoughts come and go without forming the same patterns. And over time, this becomes the new baseline, a system that is still functioning, but no longer dominated by the same cycles. And that shift is what changes how your mind feels overall. What this ultimately reveals is that loops are not a permanent feature of your mind. They are a result of how certain systems interact. Pattern recognition, attention, memory, and prediction working together in a specific way. When those systems operate under the same conditions repeatedly, loops form. But when those conditions change, the outcome changes as well. This is what makes the process flexible. It is not fixed or unchangeable. It responds to how it is used, how it is reinforced, how it is engaged with over time. And that responsiveness is what allows loops to weaken, to reduce, to eventually lose their dominance. Not because they are removed, but because the system that created them is no longer operating in the same way. And that is where lasting change comes from. And once that becomes clear, the experience of your mind begins to feel different in a fundamental way. The loops that once felt automatic and unavoidable are now seen as patterns that arise under specific conditions. They no longer feel like something you are trapped inside. They feel like something that appears but does not have to continue. And that difference changes how you relate to your thoughts. They are no longer signals that must be followed, but events that can be observed. This removes the sense of inevitability. It shows that the loop is not something that exists on its own, but something that depends on how the system is engaged, and when that engagement changes, the loop changes with it, not through force, but through understanding. And that understanding is what ultimately allows your mind to move differently.